good afternoon or good day. This is Dr. Loder with Conversations with Dr. Greer, and I'm joined today in early May by Dr. Jan Bravo.
Hello. Nice to be here.
We want to thank the World Puja Network for hosting Conversations with Dr. Greer. And today we have kind of a special part one of a two-part series. 10 years ago this week, on May 9th, 2001, the CSETI and the Disclosure Project held the Disclosure Project meeting or briefing at the National Press Club. This was a seminal meeting in which we had over 20 witnesses, both military, industrial, governmental witnesses, talking about their efforts, their sightings, and what they had learned about the UFO/ET or extraterrestrial activities. As part of that activity, Dr. Greer and I wrote a almost 500-page briefing document for the press and the public, and a 90-page or so executive briefing document. It was a massive undertaking. Many people were involved. The witness activity went on for over a year. During that time, Dr. Greer and others videotaped literally over 100 witnesses, deep throat, if you will, witnesses in some cases, military people, government agency people, and private industry people, as well as private citizens, talking about what they had seen, what they had heard, what they learned, where they had worked. Almost all of them, or at least many of them, had government documents backing up what they were saying. And this is a monumental task to gather all that information together. As an aside, 100 hours of videotape testimony was subsequently condensed, if you will, down to 20 to 30 hours. That was further condensed down to a 2-hour and a 4-hour videotape or DVD. That's now available on the Disclosure Project website. That's for those interested. I assume that almost everybody listening to the World Puja and Conversations with Dr. Greer will have known of, read, looked at, memorized, perhaps, the Disclosure Project website. That's www.disclosureproject.org. And it's there. You can download much of this information, executive summary, and some of the other information. You can purchase DVDs of some of the information and actually watch. A number over the last 10 years since that's happened, a number of small clips have appeared on YouTube from the Disclosure Project. But if you want to get the whole impact, really want to get the whole impact, sit down and watch the 4-hour DVD. Wow. It's sort of overwhelming. Jan, you've done that. I've done that. Any thoughts?
May I add at this point that since that time, Dr. Greer's list of people that he's interviewed and had documentation from, really high-level people, has grown to nearly 500 people. It's an amazing cache of information and evidence. So much has happened along that line since 2001.
Yes, and just it's interesting. A lot of these people say, well, where are they? Or I've heard people complain about, well, what has the Disclosure Project done since then? Well, we'll be talking about that. Dr. Greer and I will be speaking about that in a later World Puja conversation, and we will go into what's happened since then. Today, what we want to do is give you some background to how it all came about. Both Dr. Bravo and I were intimately involved in the Disclosure Project for several years. Prior to its actual event, we were both there. I co-wrote the briefing document with Dr. Greer, and Dr. Bravo was involved in many other aspects behind the scenes, supporting the thing to help make it all happen. So it was the work of many people to pull this all together. It was, in fact, it was a bit overwhelming, I think, at times, Jan.
Yes, I have to agree, but it was so wonderful from the point of view that people had the courage to step forth and do something. We have a lot of talk. There's debate back and forth, and often people on such issues will have an opinion. I'm sure everyone has an opinion, but when people put action to their words, that's what really counts. And I think if we can see by what's happening actually at this time in other countries, where the public's coming forth and saying, this is what's important to us, democracy, truth, I think that's part of what got the Disclosure Project out in the first place, and the ball has continued to roll. And I think this is very timely that we're having this discussion at this point, right, Ted?
Absolutely, and it's the 10-year anniversary, so one always puts those milestones when you start to work in the form of decades instead of years, and see what has happened and what should happen, what will happen, and what have you. So to that end, I'll start with some thoughts and going back a bit in history, back into the early mid-'90s to sort of lead you up to the Disclosure Project. And then in the second half of this, we'll talk about many of the recommendations that the Disclosure Project made at that time 10 years ago to sort of lay the groundwork for the discussion in part two. During the early 90s, Jan, please jump in here to add things if you wish. During the early 90s, Dr. Greer briefed numerous people within the government and within the military on the reality of the existence, shall we say, or the reality of visitation to this planet by extraterrestrials, and the fact that some in the military and some in the government knew about this reality and had worked with it. Others had absolutely no clue and had been a victim, shall we say, of the press and the media on this particular subject. In the mid-'90s, he put together a briefing document, Starlight Project, I believe it was, for the Clintons, for Rockefeller, Lawrence Rockefeller, and for President at that time, William Clinton. Those briefing, the Clintons decided that although the subject, they could understand it, at some level decided it was too hot a topic and it was too dangerous to get into. Now, this is a little sad because this is the President of the United States and deciding that they didn't want to go there. That was in the mid-'90s. By 1997, Dr. Greer had ascertained that perhaps what he needed to do was to get some of these witnesses, and even then there were many, many witnesses he had who had spoken with him, to present their information in a closed briefing in a congressional hearing or congressional briefing, only for members of the Congress, Senate, and their staff and members of the military. About 100 people attended that meeting. I personally was there as a representative of the governor of New Hampshire, who is presently our senator, Jean Shaheen, and she appointed me to go there as a representative. There's some funny stories associated with that, but I won't go into right here. Bottom line was there was over a dozen witnesses, including Edgar Mitchell and others, talking about the reality of the UFO ET issues. Now, the hope that was the hope that at that time it wasn't called the Disclosure Project, Project Starlight. The hope at that time was that Congress would take this information, members of Congress would take this information presented by those witnesses and hold open hearings, or at least closed hearings, and then ultimately open hearings on the subject, and sort of get this into the congressional consciousness and ultimately the public consciousness. And so from April, I think it was in April sometime, 1997, until for about a couple years, Dr. Greer and I and others worked kind of behind the scenes, briefing people, talking about what we had heard and what have you. Congress considered it, members of Congress always considered it a hot potato. They would explain, I don't want to do this. Perhaps the chap down the hall, he's from another state. Maybe he's willing to do it. And so it was bounced around with nobody standing up and say, hey, we need to do this. Later on, Representative Schiff from New Mexico did attempt to hold hearings. He died soon after there of cancer. So that didn't go as far as we'd hoped. So by the late, by 99 or so, Dr. Greer and the team realized that Congress was not going to stand up and do the grown-up thing and hold hearings on this information, that it was going to have to be taken to the public. And that is the genesis of the Disclosure Project, which was to take this information to the world press and to the public. Jan, do you want to hop in there a bit?
You're doing fine. In fact, quite well.
Okay, well, I'll continue a little bit more on that. She was involved an awful lot in early meetings with the Disclosure Project. I wasn't involved at all, and so she could probably help us a little bit on that. But by probably, it was 2001, probably 2000, late 99, early 2000, the team decided that something had to be done in terms of the public, as I mentioned. And so for the next, during the summer of 2000, spring, summer of 2000, there was massive efforts by many people on the team to work with the various witnesses, get their videotape, take literally more than 1,000, several thousand pages of transcripts from all of their documentation and sort of boil this down to something that could be actually handled. As I said, several products, and I'll talk about the disclosure meeting in a minute, but several projects came out of that effort by all the people. And one was, as I mentioned earlier, a distillation of the best, hopefully the best of the best of the witness testimonies condensed down to a 2-hour and a 4-hour video. While that was happening, Dr. Greer was also working with others on editing all of the transcripts into what became, soon after the Disclosure Project was over, the briefing was over, the Disclosure Book, which is, golly, I have it here in my hand. It's, let's see, 570 pages of briefing information, witness testimony, government documents, some obtained to the Freedom of Information Act, some given to the Disclosure Project by people behind the scenes. And so it's a massive compiled pile of information concerning the ET and the UFO realities. So
I'll step in here at this point and say, if I might, that these witnesses were vetted very carefully. Right, Ted?
Absolutely.
Their credentials were checked. Their stories had to be verified by others. This is not just anecdotes of someone who comes forward and gives a story that happened to him. And this is what's important. This is really the crux of why this information is so important, because everyone was carefully vetted before any information was put into the actual disclosure.
I think that's a very, very, very good point, because the vetting process included their showing or representing their, for example, military discharge documents to Dr. Greer or to others working with us. And we have all copies of all that kind of information. So granted, the process was not perfect, but boy, it was as tight as it could be made. And in other words, so we knew who they were, that they were where they were when they said they were, that type of thing. And so, as Jan said, the vetting was extensive. And many of them had government documents backing with their names on it, backing up where they were. Commander Bethune comes to mind. He was a commander of the Navy flying from Iceland to Reykjavik, Iceland to Newfoundland when everybody in the craft on the airplane, this is way back in the early 50s, everybody saw a major craft come up out of the ocean, circle around their plane, and go back down. And there were everybody on that plane wrote a report, and all those reports ultimately became available through Freedom of Information Act with everybody's name on it. So that's part of the kind of vetting process that went on at that time.
Right.
Let's see, where to next here, Jan? Shall we start on the recommendations, or a little bit more background?
I think it's fair to start on the recommendations now because these are important. They are still as important now as they were 10 years ago.
That is certainly true. One other comment about the actual event itself, and then we'll dive into the recommendations. The event was held at the National Press Club, in the main ballroom in the National Press Club. There were several hundred people there, members of the press, some members of the public, the witnesses themselves, and other people associated with some of the witnesses, as well as over 20 TV cameras, cameramen, and reporters from the world's major media right across the back of the room. Although we've told this story in the past, it's worth telling again. The cameramen, who were probably pretty bored with a lot of Washington, D.C. goings-on, as you might say, were calling up their office and say that, and one after the other, almost saying, this is the real thing. We are not leaving with 10 minutes in the can, so to speak. We're staying here for the whole thing. This is the real thing. These are the real people. So that was a very exciting time. And interestingly enough, even the cameramen were clapping, giving applause to the witnesses one after the next as they stood up and told their brief story backed up by all these documents. So that was quite a wonderful aspect of it, and for those of us who were there, it was a wonderful event which followed on several years of major work on our part. So to that end, Jan mentioned, and I mentioned these recommendations that we put into the document. And what I'd like to do is, or what we'd like to do, is to sort of go through these and discuss them. They are available. You can download them in the main briefing document, and some of these recommendations are in various places on the Disclosure Project website, so you can obtain them and sort of read them and kind of think about them. As Dr. Bravo said, they are as applicable today as they were 10 years ago, which in many ways is kind of a sad commentary because not as much has happened in terms of these as we hoped would happen, but you can just do what you can do. So there's two things that I'd like to mention in the briefing document. One is that there's a major chapter on energy technologies, which ties into the Orion project, which is something both Dr. Bravo and I are members of the board and work with that almost on a daily basis. There's a 20-some page article that I put together with input from Tony Craddock, who was our webmaster at the time and has worked with Tom Bearden's energy technologies, energy from the vacuum series of DVDs. He helped write that. Paul LaViolette, a senior scientist, and Dr. Paul LaViolette has written a number of books on energy technologies and other interesting things. I helped write it. Tom Bearden helped write some of it. So there's multiple people. It discusses various energy technologies as well as some anti-gravity technologies. So it's there's a lot of, and with a lot of references. Anybody interested in that? You might want to take a read of that. It's a nice summary of that information. Okay, so we have arrived now at some of these recommendations. We'll start with, go through the series here. We'll start with the press and the public. The press and the public actually play a major gatekeeping role on the information about UFOs and extraterrestrial reality as well as their technologies. It is well known among a lot of people who are dealing with this subject that the press is controlled on this subject. The press has become an unknowing partner in the distribution of the information and disinformation and misinformation about the various events that have occurred. For example, it's very rare that the press will that an event will be publicized on a national level. It's often local stuff, and when reports are often made, it is rare that, as I said, they're on a national level, and everybody who's ever watched television or read reports about UFO sightings realizes that the press typically adds what we call, and others have called, the giggle factor, leaving the audience confused, turned off, and sort of, oh, okay, it's not real, it's just sort of like a little giggle thing. And if anybody's watched CNN reporters as well as any other of the major media, they will often, now it's time for the woo-woo report, that type of thing. It's very, very annoying for those of us who know the subject is real. Dan, do you want to start?
Not only real, but important. And as you think about it, the press has really given reality shows and certain talking heads on television. What used to be the press, even news shows, have become entertainment shows. And if you think of where entertainment's gone, it's not difficult to see that this issue has morphed. That is, remember about 20 years ago, what were the movies out about ETs? E.T. and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, all which have hopeful messages and important messages about contact. What do we have now? Well, everywhere from the movie Independence Day, where people go kick alien butt, to you can just see any movie out now about, quote, aliens, actually their view of extraterrestrials, shows them as evil. There's violence. They want to hurt us. We want to hurt them. It's quite a difference, and I think these things are very apparent and very concerning. And when kids grow up thinking, "Oh my, someone coming from another planet is going to blow us up, take us over, use us for food," all of these things, it's really a sad way for kids to grow up because it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but also it's just harmful in a lot of ways. And that's taken over the entertainment part of the media. But again, that and the press seem to go hand in hand, don't you think, Ted?
Absolutely. And this is why we, as our recommendations, we suggest that any reporter who's going to report on this stuff is really should familiarize themselves with the evidence that's available. And there's just tons of evidence, as well as the implications of it. Too many of them don't know anything about the evidence. They just know about other reporters chatting about little green men, and they don't get away from that. They don't really do their homework, and that's a commentary on reporting in general, but it's particular in this particular issue. They also should, as Jan mentioned, very importantly, this is probably, one could argue, but probably one of the most important issues facing the world today. The fact that we are not alone, the fact that there are technologies that would get us off oil and get us away from our present non-sustainable world in terms of both political as well as material, food, et cetera, the way we're going. And this information needs to be conveyed in a very responsible, serious manner, and not a giggle factory with little green men, weird camera angles, colored lights, fog generators, and all the other tools that the media uses to confuse the reader or the watcher and belittle the topic.
It's interesting as we talk about this. Most of the scary stuff is anecdotal, whereas the Disclosure Project and other sources have evidence and facts. I just think that's interesting.
That's a very good point, because Dr. Greer has mentioned many times, I think publicly as well as privately, that when he has spoken with the people on the inside who really know what's going on, not the fearmongers, who really know what's going on, he said they've told him that they have no sense of fear, or that the earth is being taken over, any of these other fear-based paradigms that are publicly presented. So people that really understand that know that, but the ones in between that know a little bit but not a lot generally speak this fear thing. We also need, I think the press also needs to, instead of assigning the latest sighting or information to their very junior reporters who really don't have the depth or background to do a serious report on it, they really need to put nationally recognized senior reporters who can really do the in-depth information study reporting on this subject. That makes a big difference.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Just as long as the facts and the truth are brought out, that's what's important. And again, this has been said over and over, but it needs to be said again. It seems really intuitive, if not obvious, that if another civilization can reach this planet or other civilizations can reach this planet, their technology must be far ahead of solid-state fuels, rockets, getting them here. The point being, if they had this malice and if they wanted to destroy us a la Independence Day, they could do it at any moment, and it would seem would have done it if there was anything here that they wanted particularly. And it just seems so obvious and really common sense to act from an intelligent step-off point versus a fear-based one.
Such a good point. So good point. We've often spoken about this, that any civilization capable of traveling among the stars and whatever else is really very far advanced. They've undoubtedly gotten rid of the wars in their own planets if they ever had them. These technologies that travel among the stars include an understanding of really life itself, the nature of materials, reality, nature of consciousness, ability to transmute elements from one to another. So they don't need to come get our gold or whatever else. The Bank of China has it all. They don't need to get our gold. They can transmute it and make their own. So they really don't need the material types of things that is often proposed based upon the human model of opening up the West to get their own materials approach on things.
Right. That's a very good point. Moving along, we think it's very important for people, the public, to step forward and make their thoughts and concerns known. First of all, just by opening their minds to the UFO extraterrestrial issues and really investigating them themselves. And we think that once people have determined that we need more information, true investigation, this can be a focus, a seed to help move us toward really a concerted effort on the part of everyone, countries, the world, to make contact in a good way, to understand what's going on because it is there, and to really step forward in a safe, educated way to get something done. Again, I mentioned earlier what's going on in the Middle East, the Arab Spring. People finally had enough. It started with one country, and it blossomed. Violence certainly has no place in this, but education and true investigation does.
So true, and people say, well, what can I do? In that sort of way sometimes. What can I do? Well, there are some things that an individual sitting at home can do. And, one of those things, not sure how much big an effect it has, but it has some effect, is writing letters, not sending emails. They don't do much for the government, but writing letters to their congressmen, senators, asking for them to look into this subject or sort of open their open hearings. Note to them that there are multiple witnesses. As we said, the Disclosure Project has nearly 500. Not sure whether it's a little more or a little less right now today, but nearly 500 witnesses to this subject who know it's real. People who were particularly people who were in the government, military or corporate, who know this subject is real, either worked with material from down to ET craft, or worked with ETs themselves, or know the subject is real, radar operators, what have you. We asked them to contact the Disclosure Project to build up our base of people who know this subject, and also ask them to sort of be open about talking about the reality of this subject.
Right. This grassroots effort is very important because essentially we're a grassroots effort, and look what was accomplished by what Dr. Greer put into motion. So people do matter, and the help of each person is important. Ultimately, the public is going to help drive this effort.
That's so true. In fact, I think I don't know what the percentages are today, but as far as I understand, more than half the people in the country, perhaps the world, believe that we're being visited by extraterrestrials, and yet the government continues to deny it. It's almost like the emperor has no clothes, and yet we just sort of continue on year after year in that sort of government non-leading mode.
Right. We've heard figures from 70% to 84%. What is important is whatever percent needs to do something. We're doing what we can, and we appreciate everyone doing, just following your hearts and doing something.
That's so true. And, well, there we are. That's the public and the press. Interesting, back in, remember, about 1900 or so, a fellow by the name of Hansen wrote a book, and I'll just mention it here because it really, called The Missing Times, Terry Hansen, The Missing Times, Media Complicity in the UFO Coverment. And he really talks about the role of the media and how it has covered this up, and that almost every major media corporation or outlet in the country has somebody assigned to them who is in charge of keeping this thing under wraps. In other words, there's a gatekeeper almost everywhere on this subject, and we've been told this by numerous people. Well, should we move on to congressional action? So those are what the press and the people can do. Congress could play a very critical role because they have subpoena power and they have government authority, if you will, to hold hearings on almost any topic they want. They do these things on some crazy topics now and then, baseball teams and others, but they seem to have dropped this ball big time. There's only been 2 hearings in Congress on the UFO subject, and one was in April of 1966, and Representative Gerald Ford, who became president, had known about hundreds of people seeing ET craft in Michigan, and put together some hearings on the subject. It didn't go very far, other than the fact that at least he tried. There was an independent recommendation for scientific investigations, which became a University of Colorado study by Edward Condon, but that kind of was compromised ultimately in terms of what was reported. Later on in 1968, one of the House committees held a symposium on unidentified flying objects. A number of scientists, 6 scientists testified. 5 suggested that there was a valid scientific anomaly that should further studied. In other words, 5 out of 6 scientists said, hey, we need to study this further. There's some scientific evidence here that this needs it more, and of course, it never went very far. And I just want to quote, there's a great quote by James McDonald, who was a senior physicist, a professor at that time, who stated, my own study of the UFO problem has convinced me that we must rapidly escalate serious scientific attention to this extraordinary, intriguing puzzle. A year later, that Condon committee concluded there was no scientific evidence and recommended Project Blue Book be terminated, which happened that year in 1968. So there's been attempts, and then somebody behind the scene pulling the strings on that thing. So we then come to, in spite of the fact that Representative Gerald Ford, later President Gerald Ford, said we owe it to the people to establish credibility regarding UFOs. That was a long time ago, and the government as a whole is still in that position of owing it to the people to establish credibility. So I'll let Jen pass this on to you. We recommend Congress to...
Well, we recommend that Congress pursue this matter, to ask for make directed inquiries to the important committees, the chairman and contacts of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, and inquire directly to various facilities and agencies and entities that have knowledge of this information in the government, and really convene congressional hearings whereby witnesses can testify. That is really a big step. It's important that Congress pursue this, because they actually, as elected officials, hold a portion of our safety and security, as this is a national security issue, in their hands.
That is so true, and that's that inquiry regarding facilities, agencies, and entities in several of the books and the Disclosure Project briefing document is a page list of various facilities in the United States that deal with the whole UFO issues. Underground facilities, many of them dealing with either downed craft or material from the ETs or information concerning that. We know where many of them are, in fact most of them, and have lists of where they are and some contact information. But it would take a congressional inquiry to get at that information and to pass information concerning the validity of the national security oaths. Many people in the military and quasi-governmental organizations have assigned security oaths relative to this information. It's interesting because many of these organizations dealing with the cover-up, if you will, are not really sanctioned by the U.S. government. They're a private quasi-governmental agency that interface with the military. So these people need to be given permission under oath, under a congressional senatorial hearings, to speak about what they actually signed a security oath over. And so they aren't penalized by that. That's a very, very important step in this whole process.
The key point being that there's no oversight over these black projects, and people, many people in the military, very many good people, by the way, who really believe in this country, once they've signed this oath and they are in these projects, again, if there's no congressional, even general military oversight over the projects, then they are by definition illegal. And that's the point that Ted just made, which needs to be pounded home. Interestingly, because of the interconnections between the UFO issue and the world's energy status, that is, you've heard on this program before, a great deal of the secrecy is due to the fact that some people believe if it were known that individuals from other worlds were visiting this Earth, it would be clear that they needed an advanced technology, which we don't have. If we were to have those technologies, then it would take us off oil and gas. It's a natural progression of energy technology, and we know about them. Of course, many people know about them. You know about them. You know about the possibility of them. So, because of that interconnection between the UFO and the world's energy status and technology, it will also be necessary to hold congressional hearings on the energy issues as well. Once the reality of the UFO issues are accepted by Congress, then we can recommend that Congress thoroughly investigate these new technologies, both from current civilian sources as well as compartmented projects within the military, intelligence, and corporate contracting areas. These are now suppressed. These are now unknown to many people, but as Ben Rich, who headed the Lockheed Skunk Works facility, said, back in the 60s, we currently have the ability to travel among the stars, but it will take an act of Congress to get these technologies out. I think that's this was heard by more than one Disclosure Project witness. This is verified, and it's a fascinating statement, and it's time. We need to have Congress specifically demand that the seizing and suppression of technologies is prohibited. They need to authorize substantial funding for basic research and development, just like we're trying to get the funds for by civilian scientists and technologists, making this research available to the public and to mainstream scientists. It's time to move on. It's time to get off this fossil fuel economy, which we read the data. How long can we go on this? However many years, and it's a moving timeline, but we need another answer, and indeed there is another answer. We just need to develop it, and we need to start now.
This is you're right on this issue, and it seems to me that there's two steps, and just to continue here but a comment. There are two steps: the Congress, the government, the press, the public, the military, scientists, etc. Step one for all of them is to accept, understand, and acknowledge extraterrestrial reality. That's step one. You have to acknowledge and understand it is real. It is not little green man in smoke. Then once you have that knowledge and understand that knowledge, then we ask them, and this goes for all groups of everybody on the planet, to act on the information and do the right thing. And that's what Jan is talking about, what Congress, Senate and Congress needs to do. For example, once they know that, once they've investigated the relationships between three things, energy, ETs, and control of the planet, those three things are totally linked. Once that understanding occurs, then the Congress has to help the U.S. population of the world develop plans for dealing with disclosing these technologies, such as the kind that Ben Rich spoke about, and the transition to a non-fossil fuel economy that is minimally disruptive to the planet. That is a big thing on the plate, and which is why it's been kept under wraps. It's too big for most people to get their head around.
Right, but it's time.
It is definitely time. Disclosure Project, of course, is ready to help Congress with names of witnesses under security from their security oaths or what have you, but it has to be done in the proper manner.
Right.
Yeah, the next group, we just have a few minutes left here. So the next group I want to talk about is the military. One thing that CSETI and the Disclosure Project have learned over the years is that it has become obvious to us that senior members of the military very often are not informed on this subject. They have no clue of the reality of ETs and the realities of UFO, i.e. Technologies way beyond what they have. And they also recognize, and some of them at least recognize, the dangers of secrecy regarding this. In fact, Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, who was involved in this thing very early on, said in one of his writings, "I urge immediate congressional action to reduce the dangers from secrecy about unidentified flying objects." He spoke about the dangers from secrecies, not the dangers of the UFO ET inhabitants themselves. Very interesting twist there.
Right. Right.
And he understood there was danger. So we recommend military and national leaders take a number of actions. One, they need to get briefed on this subject by people who know. develop rules of engagement so that there's not an antagonistic rules rein in the rogue elements within the military and quasi-government military organizations that are actually targeting and attempting to shoot down, and in some cases successfully shoot down, extraterrestrial craft. This has got to stop. There's a group basically who decided to take a war to space without congressional, senatorial, or public or presidential okay on that. This has got to stop, and that the military people get a sense of the covert projects that are literally using billions and perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars a year. It just disappeared money.
That's a very good point. Put it into new energy sources. Speaking of which,
security.
Once all this is absolutely, very important. We recommend that the scientific community step forward as well. There's still a major acceptance problem among most scientists with UFO ET issues. But
my gosh,
yes, Ted, as a PhD scientist, you know this well. You know what you've encountered throughout your
absolutely
time. And the thing is that people need to have the chance, actually, the funding and the opportunity to move forward. There is suppression in certain corners where people who want to do new things don't get funding, where people who have found things have lost their funding. Correct, Ted?
That is correct.
And certain technologies have been either grabbed up, even from universities, as they've been identified, let's say discovered, not invented, but discovered, for national security reasons. It would seem the bigger national security issue is that countries are fighting over scarce resources. That's the real issue, and it's time for everybody to work together. And I know that sounds like a big thought, but it's necessary if the world is going to survive. I think many people know that. I mean, the fact that we have our doomsday clock telling us, and people are battening down for 2012, whatever that means. I think it's really important to give those people a chance. And if all these other recommendations are worked on, that's a natural follow-on that the scientific community opens up. I mean, my goodness, people used to be burned for saying that the sun was the center of our, that the Earth went around the sun, and then finally it was okay to say that because it was true, but it took a long time. We need to move on into the truth. Again, that's what's important, the truth.
Yeah, I think your comments are right on. And to elaborate a couple little tidbits here, the history of science over the last, since the scientific revolution, say the last 500 years, has been replete with people saying things that are impossible. And I think the one that we all know about perhaps are the Wright brothers, who demonstrated heavier than air flight with their airplanes back in the early 1900s, years after they had demonstrated this many places around the world. Some scientists were still saying it was impossible, even though there they were flying around. So that sort of thing. It's interesting, having been a scientist all my life so far, is that many scientists, they get their own paradigm, their own view of the world, their own scientific thing. They teach their classes at universities, and when new things come along, if they aren't involved in it, or it really goes against their own paradigm view of the world or their view of the world, they really have a hard time accepting that. And I think Dr. Peter Storick, a solar physicist, very well known, highly respected senior solar physicist, now a emeritus professor at Stanford, and I've met with him, had lunch with him, talked with him about this a number of times, put together a major committee studying this subject. His comment about scientists is rather interesting and succinct. The definite resolution of the UFO enigma, he calls it, will not come about unless the problem is subject to open and extensive scientific study. Okay, that's the way scientists operate, by the normal procedures of established scientists. And here's the clincher. This requires a change in attitude, primarily on the part of scientists and administrators in universities. And I ran into this thing with both scientists and administrators at my university when I would talk about this subject. One other little tidbit I like to talk about or like to mention, I was at Harvard at a major talk by a senior woman in the CSETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And she had spent about an hour talking about the need for money for the CSETI program, which, by the way, is losing a lot of its funding, which you may have heard of. The antenna array is no longer funded right now. It's been closed down partly just the last month or so. Anyway, I asked a question of this woman at the end of her talk about CSETI, and I explained that I had been in a congressional briefing in Washington, D.C., and military and government witnesses had spoken to reality. And shouldn't the SETI program do some searching instead of out there on the planet Earth and look at the data and information on planet Earth? Now, the interesting point is, she said, there's absolutely, in sort of a huffy attitude, actually, she said, there's absolutely no evidence that anything has been on Earth. Next question. Now, this gives a very interesting perspective on the view of things, and one that many scientists you have to be aware of. One, you can only explain her activities two ways, and both of them are afraid to say damning. One, she was either unaware of the evidence on the subject, the depth of evidence, the thousands of pages of evidence of witnesses, in which case, why would she have been the head or the deputy head of the whole SETI program? She's not aware of the evidence. So that's a question. That's not good to have somebody who doesn't know what's going on be in charge. Or second, the only other explanation is that she did know of all that evidence, and she was keeping it secret or not admitting it to it so that she could go on with her own program of misinformation, disinformation for SETI research. Either way, she is being non-truthful, non-scientific, and either way, essentially, is damned by that kind of attitude. And it's sort of a sad commentary that there are many scientists who sort of fit that bill. So scientists need to open up their minds about the possibility of this phenomenon and stop prejudging others in the area. Scientists need to do their own research. I've talked to so many scientists who read one article and think they're an expert, and I've literally spent hundreds, if not thousands, of hours researching, studying, working with people, talking to witnesses on the subject. And boy, you get a sure different view of that than if you have somebody just reading an article or two in some magazine that is basically put out as disinformation. You want to continue, Jan, at this point?
Yeah. A few other things. Just a closing type of comment. One of the major stumbling blocks to disclosure is that those are involved with the cover-up are afraid of retribution once the government and people realize both the depth and the extent of deceit that's occurred over the past half century. So even though we don't condone what's been done, we think it's time we should be prepared to forgive and move on. Have everybody work towards bringing out truth. There's nothing to be gained by calling for severe retribution for those involved with either current or past secrecy, but ask that they open up and work together to bring this out, because even if we had a free energy, or some people like the term zero-point energy device, or just even new technologies, even something that would greatly enhance fuel mileage. These things all take time to develop and bring out, and that's something that doesn't just happen overnight. So the sooner we start and the sooner we move together to progress, the better we'll be. So I think that's an amazing amazing thought. When I first heard of it, I had to work with it, but I understand that absolutely it's the right way to go. Don't you think, Ted?
Yes, and many, back to the scientists for a moment, there are scientists who do know about this subject, and they may be tier 1 scientists who are involved in the subject deeply at a scientific level, but they can't talk about it to anybody. So they need to come forth and help some of their colleagues who are good scientists but have been out of the loop on this, sort of some call them the tier 2 scientists, who are sharp scientists but are in the conventional world, not in this world of new technologies and new information and zero-point technologies and what have you. The last recommendation that we had is a set of recommendations for the President of the United States. Now, keep in mind very briefly, the President of the United States has been briefed on this subject from the 1940s onward. President Eisenhower was complained about losing control of this subject, and he was deeply involved in it. And I know people who worked personally with President Eisenhower on that information at that time, and yet he warned us of the military-industrial complex and the complications arising from that. One of the things the Disclosure Project has done is, in the last couple of years, is to produce briefing documents for the President Obama. We briefed other presidents. We know a briefing document. President Bush was in the White House at the time for the Disclosure Project briefing. That 500-page briefing document was given to one of his people, President W. Bush's people, and taken directly to the White House. We saw this happen. So we know that information got in there. President Clinton and his people were briefed by Dr. Greer, and we have briefed President Obama. None of these presidents have moved forward, and there's a whole bunch of recommendations. You can go to the disclosureproject.org, www.disclosureproject.org, and to look at the recommendations given to the President Obama, just within the last several years. Dr. Greer will speak about that in terms of what's happened since the Disclosure Project has occurred. Including the need for executive orders to terminate certain black projects, as Dr. Bravo mentioned, work with the security oaths people, and so that people can come forward without give them total amnesty, and move forward. Any more final comments, Jen, before I close?
No, I appreciate everyone who's listening, and we thank you for your support.
Thank you very much. Once again, we thank the World Puja Network for hosting conversations with Dr. Greer. And this is Dr. Greer. This is not Dr. Greer. I'm babble. This is Dr. Ted Loder, who works with Dr. Greer on this subject, and Dr. Jan Bravo. Thanking you very much for listening, and come back in a couple of weeks and stay tuned.
Bye-bye.